And let me tell you why I chose this spot. First, real quickly, you can see I shaved. It's one day after I finished that last piece, and I'll continue to where I left off. One day later would leave us with January 6th, 1994. And I'm going to choose a couple of places to finish this interview. I chose my house, the house where I live in right now with Florencia, and the house where I grew up. And then right now I'm going to shoot at the high school, or in front of the high school, with Mount Tamalpais in the background. And eventually I'll probably get to a few other places, but I'll let you see those as we continue the interview. But let me tell you real quick why I chose this spot here. As you can see in the background, you can see the clock tower of Tamalpais High School, and you can certainly see Mount Tamalpais, the Sleeping Lady, probably the most distinguishing landmark in Marin County, and certainly Mill Valley. This area here, not long ago, my mother, Marietta, your grandmother or your great-grandmother, whoever might be watching this, told me that I can't remember exactly how she said it. She either said that she felt like she had lived a previous life in Monument Valley, or something to the nature of, in her post-life, she hopes to go there, or she wants to have her ashes scattered there, one of those. Anyway, a combination of those thoughts is kind of the way I feel about this spot here. Being on the baseball fields and football fields where I played and focused a great deal of my youth from ages 13 through 18. This was really the focus of everything that I enjoyed doing. Baseball, football, and basketball to a certain extent. And as I grow into my early adult years, or early middle-age years, Mill Valley and Mount Tamalpais has become a real special part of my life as well. And just sitting here and looking at the high school and the mountain gives me a special feeling of belonging, almost as though this is where I was meant to be. So that's kind of why I chose this spot, and this is why not only is Mill Valley, but Tamalpais High School and Mount Tamalpais a special area for me. Where did I leave off yesterday? I was talking about the areas we lived in. I got as far as 1979, where I moved to Los Angeles and was living in Canoga Park. I lived in Canoga Park at 19933 Roscoe Boulevard, apartment 22, for 3 years, from 1979 until 1982. And my roommates at that time were Pat Quinlan, one of my best friends from high school, and Lisa Tustin, who at the time was my girlfriend and high school sweetheart. And I'll elaborate more on her as well, certainly, as the tape goes by. 3 years later, I got married with Lisa, and again, this is another area which I'll elaborate on more as time goes by, as the tape goes on. But Lisa and I got our own apartment in Studio City in 1982 at 12054 Moorpark Street, apartment number 7 in Studio City. And at the time, our telephone number was 213-763-2515. And except for the fact that the area code changed in 1984 to 818, that was my telephone number for 10 years, 763-2515. During the year of 1988, I went to live in Mexico. And again, that's something I'll elaborate more on as the time goes by. But that was where I spent the better part of 1988 at Calle Alejandro 3187 in Guadalajara. And I came back to Studio City in 1989 after living in Guadalajara for a year, and was there for 3 more years up until 1992, when by that time I was married with Florencia, and we came to live up here in Mill Valley. So that covers the houses lived in. Let's move on here so this doesn't get too long. Let's see what time it is here so that I keep an eye on the watch. Okay. I like to lick my fingers so I can get a handle on that. That's what Joe Montana used to do. Every time Joe Montana would go to the line of the football, he'd do this. Look at the line of scrimmage. Schools. I'm going to tell you about all the schools I went to. In 1965, I think it was either 65, let's just say 65, was my first year in school at kindergarten. This is as far back as I remember. Kindergarten, I went to Colonel Nichols School in Bakersfield. I can't remember the name of my teacher. I can't remember the name of a single one of my friends. Although I do have a picture of it, and looking at that picture I can recognize faces and recognize the teacher. But I only went there 1 year, so it didn't have much of an impact on me. There were a few specific memories I have of that school. One was that our kindergarten area was kind of lopped off, caged off or fenced off from the rest of the school. And I always looked beyond the fences where the big kids were, where the real kids were, where the real school was. And since I was only at Colonel Nichols School for kindergarten, I never got a chance to go be with the big kids. In 1966, I entered, I was going to call it primary school, it's called elementary school. And I was in the first grade for only a half a year at a school in San Luis Obispo called Pacheco School. And again, I can't remember any friends, any teachers, very vague memories of the school. I do remember we had to take the bus. We lived in San Luis Obispo. I talked about this just a minute ago. We lived across town in San Luis Obispo, and I actually should have been going to Sinsheimer School. But for whatever reason, they bused us across town to Pacheco School, where we only went for half a year before we moved out to the country club area. And I guess it was February or March that we moved out to the country club area, and I started what would be 4 years at a school called Los Ranchos, which was in between Rolling Hills and the country club. It's where the kids that lived out in the country or out in the outskirts of San Luis Obispo went to school. And from what I remember, it was a very good school. Here are the names of my teachers from first grade on, second grade on. Mrs. Klein, Mrs. Peters, Mrs. Doherty, and Mrs. Haskell. And of all those, my favorite was probably my final teacher at that school, Mrs. Haskell, who I had in the 5th grade. She was an older woman. By that time, she was probably in her 50s, close to 60. And even after I moved away, I remember she wrote me letters a couple times, and I certainly wrote back, and I haven't heard from her probably in 20 years. But anyway, that was where I was at for 5 years at Los Ranchos School. In 1970, I went to Tam Valley School here in Mill Valley. I was in the 6th grade at Tam Valley School, which I had a teacher called Mrs. Johnson, who I did not like. I had quite a few conflicts for whatever reason. Perhaps it was me entering my rebellious years. Perhaps it was me being the new kid in school. Perhaps it was me not fully adjusting to living with Jim, my stepfather, for the first year. But for whatever reason, I did not like Mrs. Johnson, and it was kind of a difficult year, the 6th grade at Tam Valley School, which, as I speak, is only about 2 miles that way. One specific memory I have about Mrs. Johnson was she was ragging on me about something, and I finally just said, "Okay, Queen," and she looked at me and just, "Go to the office," which I guess was a common thing for teachers to say back then. Just go to the office, go see the principal. And instead of going to see the principal or going to the office, I was so pissed off that I marched out that door and walked all the way home. And at that time, that was quite a good walk. I mean, right now it's about a mile, and I usually rode my bike to school, but that was a heck of a walk, especially going home. And I don't think there was anybody at home. Mom was working, Jim was working, and Kirk was at school, Marisa was at school or somewhere. And I don't remember how it turned out, but that was one specific memory I have of Mrs. Haskell in the 6th grade. This also began a year of 3 years in a row, which were 3 years where I was the oldest kid in the school. And at that time, I always thought it was kind of cool to be the big kid in school, the oldest kid in the school. When I was in Los Ranchos in San Luis Obispo, I remember looking forward to being in the 6th grade because the 6th graders were the big kids. They were the oldest kids of the school. But I never got to be in the 6th grade because we moved away before I reached the 6th grade at Los Ranchos School. However, here in Mill Valley at Tam Valley, I immediately was the oldest kid in the 6th grade. And then the next year I went to a different school. No, I was not the oldest kid at the next school. 2 years later I was in the 8th grade. What I meant to say was, I got my facts confused. What I meant to say was this was the first of 4 years where I went to 4 different schools in 4 different years. Albeit the same town, the same group of friends, but I was changing schools each year for a variety of reasons. The first reason was, after 6th grade here at Tam Valley School, there was no more grades at that school, elementary school. We went to the middle school across town, which was called, at that time, it was called either junior high school or middle school, and it was called Edna McGuire. I was a 7th grader there, and at that school there were 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So I immediately went into the 7th grade at Edna McGuire. We were there for only 1 year, And let me mention a couple of teachers real quickly. Mrs. Roy, she was my primary teacher, which I had for English and science. Can you hear that bell? Listen. It's the same bell they had when I was in high school. And for the most part, it's pretty accurate, although the clock tower, oh, they got the clock tower working also. It's 2 o'clock. At 7th grade, at the Ed McGuire School in 7th grade, I do remember Mrs. Roy I mentioned her, Mrs. Hayhurst I had, who I now run with. She now is a runner with the Tamalpa group. She taught math, and all I remember about Mrs. Hayhurst and the math was that I really enjoyed her, and I was learning math, a subject that probably for me was one of my most difficult subjects through all the years. And there was only twice that I can remember having teachers that were helpful and that really gave me the ability to learn what I thought was a really difficult subject, math. That was Mrs. Mrs. Hayhurst at the Ed McGuire School, and later here at Tamalpais High School I had a teacher called Mr. Newman, who I had for an algebra class. Anyway, back at Ed McGuire, another teacher I had was Mrs. Hale. Mr. Potts I had for physical education. He was a good guy. Only after 1 year at Ed McGuire I changed to, the entire school changed. They moved out of Ed McGuire. It closed down and became a private school, and eventually became once again an elementary school. But right then at that time, the new middle school opened. Just over here, about a half a mile to the left, is what became called the Mill Valley Middle School. Brand new school. In 1971 we moved in, and I became the first, me and my classmates, we became the first graduating 8th grade class at what was the new school, the Mill Valley Middle School. I was put into a rather unusual class, sort of an experimental class. There was a combination of 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. And within that class I had the majority of my subjects with 2 teachers, with Mr. Tangway and Mrs. Susnow, who through a bizarre series of events eventually got separated from their spouses and married each other, something that the kids always teased them about. So I had Mr. Tangway and Mrs. Susnow, and my 8th grade year was one of my most memorable, and one of my, although my 4 years at Tamalpais High School were certainly memorable. But I look on it not only as being memorable, but probably the funnest time, if you can say school is fun. Some people can. If you can say school was fun, it was the funnest time for me because I was enjoying learning, and I was enjoying the challenge of different subjects. I remember we took on a variety of different angles for new subjects. On the political realm, we held class debates and class elections that helped us get involved. At that time, it was 72 was the year we went in. At that time, 1972, McGovern was running against Nixon for re-election, and we kind of did a mock debate and a mock election in the classroom. And we learned a lot about that. And I remember doing science projects where we would go outside and look at certain things in the natural world and choose something that, for whatever reason, interested us or fascinated us, and we would study that specific area of interest. We took a number of field trips. We went to Yosemite. We went to San Francisco probably a dozen times. We went to Muir Woods. We went to Muir Beach. We went to Mount Tamalpais. They took a trip once to the Grand Canyon, which I didn't go because I was playing baseball that spring. But that class took more field trips, and I can remember towards the end of the year I was getting so sick of field trips I just wanted to stay back at school. And there was one time where I told the teachers, I don't want to go on any more of these field trips. I'm sick of them. I want to stay here and do whatever I should have been doing at school. So they let me back, and I stayed with a couple people that didn't want to go on the field trip, and we stayed at school. We were the intramural volleyball champs in that class. And I'll probably get into my friends. I had a number of friends who became close friends that year who are still friends today. And I'll mention some of those names when I get to my friends list, my friends chart. We graduated in 1973, if that's what you want to call it. I was the class president, as a matter of fact, for the spring semester. So I had to give the closing speech, and somewhere in the notes at our house, I have the notes, somewhere hidden in the box, I have the notes of the speech that I gave that year. Matter of fact, my mom helped me organize my notes and helped me organize the speech that I gave to the parents and the graduating class. Back then I thought it was actually kind of silly that we were graduating from 8th grade. I thought it was no big deal because even the idiots, even the greasers and morons would graduate from 8th grade. I always thought it was kind of a mockery. and kind of cheapened graduating from high school, which I always looked at as being the graduation, a place to celebrate a graduation. So although I'm certainly my mother and the parents got excited about 8th grade graduation, to me it was no big deal. 1973, I entered Tamalpais High School, right there, and spent 4 real memorable years and real important years. As depending on what age you are as you're watching this tape, if you're approaching your teenage years, you'll find that the teenage years are certainly the most influential and certainly the most impacting years of one's life. Or if you're looking back on it, and you can probably remember them, perhaps you remember them in a traumatic way, and many people look back in their high school years as being traumatic, if that's the word I can use, in the sense that they were ridiculed, they couldn't make friends, they felt like they were not in the cliques, they felt like they were outside of the circles of the cool kids. Perhaps I was lucky. I didn't consider myself as one who was in the cliques, but I certainly did have a number of friends from different groups, so I never felt like an outsider. And in that sense alone, I always felt a part of the high school, and I always felt a part of a couple of groups. For the most part, I spent my time with the athletes. At the time, they were, to a certain extent, called jocks. But at the same time, I didn't like the label as jock, because it was kind of a stereotypical label of someone who was dumb and stupid and only cared about sports and walked around with their Letterman jacket and they thought they were cool and they had all the good-looking babes. And you know, for that reason alone, I never got a Letterman's jacket, because I didn't want to be identified as a jock. And I can remember my mother even offering me, say, hey, you want to get your nice Letterman jacket? I said, I don't want another Letterman jacket. It cost $100, and I thought it was rather presumptuous to walk around with a Letterman jacket and a big tee. Although I did eventually get my tee, and I put it on a sweatshirt later on, well after I was out of high school. So, as I get off the track a little bit, my 4 years were very enjoyable at Tamalpais High School, and I still have a number of friends who, if they don't live in town, live outside of town, and I keep in touch with as best as I can. As a matter of fact, just a few minutes ago, as I was driving down here, I ran into Bill Bishop, who was the first baseman, played first base on this field, and he was a good friend. I remember we did an Abbott and Costello act, the famous Who's on First act at the senior graduation. No, the senior talent show. And I haven't seen Bill Bishop in probably 4 years, and even when I saw him then, I hadn't seen him since high school, which was some 10 years before that. So twice I've seen the fella in 15 years. It's because he moved away to a different state and he's living in Indiana. Anyway, moving on. Some memorable teachers from my high school years at Tamalpais High School. Mr. Mack, who was my baseball coach, football coach, and a PE coach. Coach Racines, who coached the football team. Coach Gruzinski, who was the coach of the freshman football team. Beth Jury, who was a PE teacher. You can see I'm mentioning PE teachers first, probably because those were the things I enjoyed the most back then. Beth Jury taught volleyball and badminton, and I was really involved with volleyball back then, although I couldn't spike, and I still can't spike. Mr. Sherman, my American history teacher. Mr. Chavez, who taught Constitution, Marin County history. Mr. Nicholson was an English teacher. Mr. Triana, who a couple years ago passed away, he was my speech teacher. That was a class I always enjoyed. I had him for speech. Mr. Newman, who earlier I mentioned was a very good math teacher, and I also took him for a class called Middle East, which at the time focused on the problems in the Middle East. And as you hear this tape, I'm sure all the problems in the Middle East are solved, and it's a peaceful area, right? Unlike it was in 1973 when I took that class, or unlike it is now in 1993. Mr. Hetcher, the years that I was there, was the student activities director. He was also a teacher other years, but when I was there, he was the student activities director, and he was a memorable and favorite teacher of mine. Those are just the names I mentioned. I wrote down on my notes to mention. Oh boy, what else can I talk about the high school years? Like can go on forever. I remember when we finally got our driver's license. It was about the same time that the movie American Graffiti came out. So we wanted to be like the kids in American Graffiti, and we would go cruise. But it never measured up to the way it was in American Graffiti, or measured up to other towns, because most kids didn't cruise. The cliques or the groups at Tamalpais High School were so separated. They had their own areas that there wasn't that many people in a certain clique to really cruise or to really do your outside activity. Anyway, there were a dozen of us or so. We would go out and drive the cars around. We'd drive past the Sequoia Theater. We'd drive down Miller Avenue over to East Blythedale, and that was it. Aside from that, and a few egg fights when we had at the time my father had a red truck, and I would load up kids in the back of the truck, and we'd go get a dozen of eggs, and we'd go out looking for other friends in cars, and we'd see them go by in their car and hit them with eggs. And one night I came home with the truck, and our truck certainly got its fair share of eggs as well, and I didn't wash it off. Usually we washed it off that evening at the car wash, which is over by where the Long's Drugs is now. And one time I didn't wash it off, and Jim woke up the next morning and saw egg all over that truck, and he was so pissed. He says, "You get out there and you get that car cleaned up right now. Don't ever let that happen again." We went to the beach quite a bit one summer. The summer we got our driver's license. That was the summer of 1975. I didn't get to take driver's training from the school, which most kids did, because it was a very difficult class to get into, and for whatever reason I couldn't get the class at the time I needed it. So I took driver's training. I took the driver's ed, which was the written class, but I took driver's training, the actual driving class, through a private course. I paid for it with my own money because I wanted to have my license for that summer so I can go cruising and get a job. And I passed the first time, so I got my driver's license, and that was, up to that point in my life, was probably the biggest thrill of my life by that time. Later on, other little thrills have come along, and I'll certainly cover those as the tape goes by. Moving along, in 1977 we graduated. We were the class of 1977. There were about 280 kids, I think, that graduated that year. And I went to live with my father in Morro Bay. I went to Cuesta College for 2 years there. Some of the teachers I remember specifically at Cuesta College were Bob Hartwig, Ron Finn. They were involved with the TV and radio classes. Mr. Evans I had for California, for history, for American history. Bob Pelfrey taught an art appreciation class. Mr. Thompson, English. Rupert and Jim Alford were a couple of Dad's art teachers, and I had them for ceramics and a mixed media art class with Jim Alford. Mr. Morrow I had health. And while I was there, I played golf. I played on the golf team 2 years. I tried baseball one fall, but was really out of my league. I wasn't that good, and the team was a lot better. But I did play golf. Wasn't that good in golf either, but at least I was able to play on the team and travel with the team. Probably my best round of golf I ever played was playing when I was actually on the team my second year, and we played, I think it's called Rancho Coñada, Rancho Contento, Rancho something, over in the Carmel area, and I shot an 84 in rainy conditions, and not only was it my best score I ever shot on a long par 18 course, but it was the only time that my score was used on the golf team. There were 6 players, and they would take the 5 best scores. And usually my score was the 6th score, and they didn't use it. But this was the one time that my score was, I believe, the 5th, might have even been the 4th best score on the team. And it was a thrill that they used my score on the final results. I can't remember if we won, but I was thrilled enough just that I wasn't the 6th man, that I wasn't the worst scorer of the day. In 1979, I moved down to Los Angeles, and then I went to Pierce Junior College for a year, finished up and got my Associates of Arts degree. I can't remember teachers' names that well from Pierce, because I was only there 1 year, but I do remember taking a California history class that was very interesting. I took psychology, sociology, and also another American history class. That was a year where I took a lot of the basics, so they would be ready and taken care of when I eventually went to an upper division school. Then what happened? Okay, then I was out of school for a few years, went back to USC, another school which certainly played a huge part in my life, not only professionally but personally. Primarily for all the friends that I met. The majority of the friends that I have in LA, although I don't live in LA now, but the majority of the friends I had when I was there through the time that I left were USC classmates. At USC, some of the teachers I had were Mel Sloan, and these were teachers that had been there. These were teachers that were there when George Lucas was there. That's how long these people had been at USC. Mel Sloan, Ken Mura, Dave Johnson, Ken Robinson, Drew Casper, Rick Jewell. Rick Jewell taught a critic class, we call it, film criticism. I had Jim Boyle for writing, Bob McGee for writing, and he was an asshole, and everyone hated him, and it was a surprise to me that this guy got the recognition he did from the outside world. From people inside USC, they knew the guy was a jerk. Duke Underwood I had for what was called 310, and Herb Farmer was also a teacher of that. I had Russ McGregor for 290, which is the entry-level film class at USC. What did I mention here? I wanted to mention thoughts on going to a big university. I think what I mean by that is that when I was here at Talon Bias High School, I never, although it was kind of assumed that I would go to college, I never envisioned myself as going to a university, a big school where they have a big football team, where they have thousands of people, where they have a lot of prestige and a lot of famous people graduating. I for whatever reason, never visualized myself going to a big school like that. I kind of had my heart set on going to Lewis and Clark for a while, which was a small school up in Portland, or some other school. But what naturally got me focused on going to USC, and this is pretty obvious by now, is that it was the best film school in the country. And by the time I had gone to Quest, I had narrowed down my interest in film television. So that was obviously why I went to USC. But anyway, when I went to USC, it was a thrill to be there. And unlike some students or some kids, when they're at a school or in a certain situation, they don't really look around, take advantage of what they have, appreciate what they have, and enjoy the moments that they're there. On the contrary, I relished every moment that I was at USC and thought it was cool to be in a big university. We had a football team that went to the Rose Bowl. I was in a prestigious film program that only 1 out of 10 students even get accepted to. We were in the heart of Los Angeles, the area where motion pictures is the motion picture capital of the world, and people came to people from the industry would come in and speak. Barbra Streisand came to one class. She was probably the biggest shot. George Lucas and Steven Spielberg came to the opening when they moved into the new campus. And a number of other people that would come to the film classes and speak. And just the fact that we were in Los Angeles and at USC enabled that situation to take place. And while I was there, as I mentioned, I just loved every moment of it. We had this huge, glorious library that I would go to whenever I had a chance, study, take a nap, peruse through the old book section or the old scripts. They had a phenomenal section called the film history section. And during the 1984 elections, the presidents went there. The presidents-to-be went there. The president candidates went there. Wrong. The vice president candidates went there. In 1984, George Bush was a vice president candidate when Reagan was running. He went to speak at USC. And a week or two before or after, Walter Mondale, who was running Walter Mondale was running for himself. He was the vice president for Carter, but he was running that year for himself for president, and he spoke there. So the fact that these guys came to the school was yet another notch in the school, and it was another reason for me to just enjoy being there. I can remember going to see a fellow from Russia come in, and he spoke, and at that time it was towards the end of the Cold War, and it was interesting to see this fellow come from Russia and talk to students and tell them what life in Russia was like. Probably another one of my biggest thrills of going to USC was being able to film the football games. Along with Ken Robinson in the first year and Steve Wright, Herb Farmer, we were the three people that filmed the football games. We filmed the football games of a big university, a big Pac-8 university. Something that I always thought would be kind of cool. Even when I was in high school, when I would film our games here, when I was in junior high school at Pierce, I would look up on the press box and see other kids filming. I go, man, that'd be kind of cool to film games. But yet not only was I filming games, but I was filming games at USC. And I did that for 4 years. Filmed every home game, 4 straight years, and they would give us a press pass. We would get all the food and programs we wanted from the press box. We had 3 losing seasons and 1 winning season. The 1 winning season, we went to the Rose Bowl. That was the '84 season. We went to the January 1st, 1985 Rose Bowl and beat Ohio State. I didn't film that game because they only needed 1 camera, and besides, it was on television and there was nothing to review for the coaches anyway, because what I was filming were the plays for the coaches to review. But I did go to the game and enjoyed watching it, sitting up. Wait a minute, that's wrong. That's right. I didn't film it. For a minute I was thinking I did film, but no, I did not film it. It was a different game at the Rose Bowl that I filmed that I thought was the Rose Bowl game. But the Rose Bowl game against Ohio State, which Chris Spielman played in for Ohio State, as did Keith Byers. And for USC, Tim McDonald was there, but you know what? I can't even remember Tim McDonald being a big shot there, although he's now playing with the 49ers. Okay, one more school I went to, which also had a fair impact on my life and the way things have turned out, was in 1988. I went to the La Autónoma in Guadalajara, and there I studied for about a semester. I studied Spanish, and only Spanish. And I'll get into that as I cover the Spanish section. Boy, I'm losing my throat, and I've already spoken 22 minutes on just one other damn page. Let's pick it up a little faster. Oh, jeez, this is a huge section. Let me talk about my friends, okay? And I'm going to go over this real fast because this is going to take forever unless I kind of pick up the pace. When I lived in Bakersfield, I can't remember a single friend. I can remember faces and I can remember images, but I can't remember any names. There was a kid at the end of the street who had a coaster, a pedal coaster. He would pedal on it and drive around. I remember him. There were two girls across the street, two twin girls. I can't remember their names. In San Luis Obispo, I made a number of friends the 4 years I was at Los Ranchos. Tim Oliver was probably my best friend, and we spent a number of years going down hills on coasters and building tree forts and hiking in. I have the hiccups. Hiking in the hills behind the country club area. Brett Nielsen was a friend, Peter Freitas, Craig Colombo, Richard Namu. Those are probably they were probably the best friends that I had, and the friends that I remember the most from my years in San Luis Obispo. Here at Tam Valley, when I was at Tam Valley School, Pat Quinlan, one of the first guys I met, was a very good friend, and to this day, Pat is probably one of my best friends here in the Marin County area. Mike Jarvis, Mark Hansen, a fellow named Mitch, I can't remember Mitch's last name. And there was Diane Voss, who also was a friend in high school, and we've kept in touch with quite a bit. Cindy Chandler, Bridget Scott, who was, for lack of a better word, my sixth grade girlfriend. Then there were some punks. I don't know if you could say I had trouble, but there were bullies, certainly, like there are in every school. And there were some bullies that I hated at this school. Rodney Carlson, Andy Allen, who eventually became an okay guy, but Rodney Carlson, Terry McGovern, Dennis Beard, Roger Hathaway, they were assholes. And as a matter of fact, I heard long ago that Dennis Beard was killed in prison, as if I care. The other three guys, I'm sure, ended up in juvenile court or in prison, and where they are right now, who cares? Edna McGuire, where I went for my 7th grade, it was the first year I met a number of other people that also became friends for quite a while. Bruce McMahon, Bob Andrews, who was my best man at my first wedding, Kenny Nakahiro, Kevin Alexander, Steve Barrett, Gary Randolph, and Kenny Jackson. Over at the middle school in my 8th grade, David Canepa, who was now the manager of the Mill Valley Market, manager and part owner of the Mill Valley Market. I met him at the middle school. He was in my class with us down Tangway. As were Bob Andrews. Let's see, I mentioned some other names. Steve Barrett, Carol Crawford, and her brother Brian. Cindy Johnson I met that year, who is our friend who lives up in Sacramento now. Jeff Hamilton, fella named, what was his name? David Taylor? Something Taylor, but we always called him Brains because he was the smart guy. We just called him Brains. Ray Hasty, Paul Ferroni, Andrea Schreier, Nicole Victor, Susie Newman. Those are some names that come to mind when I think of the Mill Valley Middle School. And then when I think of the Tamalpais High School, which again is right behind me here, the list is enormous. Mark Langerman, Jeff Hockey, Bill Benz, Brian Pinder, Pat Quinlan, Guy Palmer, who I run with quite a bit still these days, David Canepa, who we called Dummy. Oh, and I forgot to say Langerman. Mark Langerman we call Pretty Boy, and Mark Langerman is married with Chris in San Francisco, and I saw them not long ago. Bill Bishel, who I saw just a half hour ago, Don Lopez, Lisa Holman, who was a great athlete, Mike Scannell, who was a wide receiver on our team, Lynn Stevenson, who was a very good friend and here in high school, and then eventually became a friend in the working world because she became involved in editing. She was an assistant editor on Cheers. She also got a job through Roger Corman, and we've kept in touch quite a bit as the years have gone by. Robert McFessel, who is now a carpenter. Jim Belinas, who I've lost touch with over the years. Last I heard, he was living in Davis. Christine Nasikas, who, although we were not very good friends in high school, we've certainly become better friends as the years have gone by. She's now living in Washington, D.C. Bob Andrews, who I mentioned, and I've got to give Bob a call. I haven't spoken to Bob since I moved back to Mill Valley a year ago, and I heard he's living somewhere up near Novato. Mike Wills, who we called Stinky, because right here in this locker room, which you saw a minute ago, he had the stinkiest clothes and the stinkiest uniform. The poor guy either didn't have a washing machine at home that worked or just was too lazy to wash it. And boy, did his stuff stink. Steve Harrington, who for whatever reasons we called, oh, I remember, I didn't start it. Some guy started calling him, we called him a douchebag. Yeah, you're a douchebag. Yeah, Harrington's a douchebag. Eventually we called him Herring Douche, and eventually just Douche for short. Paul Greenwood played on the football team. Sue Madden was a good volleyball player. Leslie Valentine was a good friend of Sue's. She was a volleyball player. Carolyn Reynolds was one of my high school girlfriends, and she and her family lived just behind the school here. They lived right next door to Russ Kiernan, who was a running fella we run with. Tim Grayson, who was a good baseball player, as was Ronnie Ford and Dan Lucia. Charlie Stump, they were on the football team. Dan Lucia was the quarterback on the varsity team when I was junior. Oh boy, again, I can go on. I'll just move on with some other people I knew at Cuesta. Let's move on to Cuesta College now. I don't remember names that well because these are people I didn't keep in touch with for the most part, and we only were friends for the 2 years I was at Cuesta. There was Frank, Ken, Bob Konigsberg, Gary Childress, who was one of the few people I did keep in touch with. As I did with Mark Hansen and Mark Sutherland, for that matter, at least for a few years. Right now, I couldn't tell you where they're at, and it's been years since I've kept in touch with them. At Pierce, the only people I met were that I sort of would have considered my friend. I was only there for 1 year. The people I met there were on the badminton team. I played on the badminton team the spring of 1980, and we became friends at least for those few months because we traveled quite a bit throughout the LA area playing in badminton tournaments. They were Bob, Alan, Connie, Debbie, and Judy, who was my doubles partner. Judy Borenstein was her name. And then other friends. Oh, okay, and these lists get longer as time goes by also. At Witt Thomas Harris, an area where I worked, and I'll cover that in my working page a little bit more. Bob Gorham probably was the person who I had the most contact with, the most memories of Witt Thomas Harris. Also partly because Bob Gorham died a couple years after I'd met him. He got cancer and died when he was 29 years old. When I met him, he was 25 or 26. He was the first fella that hired me for a job in Los Angeles that was involved in television. So for that fact alone, he's always gonna have a special spot in my memory. Linda Vyas, who I kept in touch with, was at Witt Thomas Harris. Frank Merwald, who I also kept in touch with, and Don Hart, who became one of my best friends in Los Angeles, was a fellow I met with. I met at Witt Thomas Harris, as was Sue Palladino. At that time, she was a secretary, and she has since gone on to become the main producer of Witt Thomas Harris Productions. At USC, I almost need a whole page to talk about USC, as what an impact that made on, as I mentioned, on my life professionally and personally. But real quickly, the names of the people who I have met there, probably Fred Wardell and John Pace are the two people that I've kept in touch with the most, who were probably my two best friends at USC. Other real good friends were John Griffith, Michael Davis, Jim Slocum, Mindy McIntyre, who married Vince DeQuatro, who actually was not in cinema. Almost all of these people that I mentioned were in the cinema program. Terry Lohr, who was probably my best friend the last year I was there. She's now living in Jordan. She married a fellow from Jordan. Kelly Kulchek, who's now producing TV shows at 20th Century Fox. Caroline Ross. I'm losing my voice. Should have brought a sucker. I'm going to have to wrap this up after the friends section. I've been talking for a half hour anyway. Christine Ackle, Scott Simmons, Randy Miller, another very good friend who is now directing, Joe Finneran, Jeff Johnson, Steve Koch, who was a baseball player, Kevin McCarthy, another softball player. Quite a few of these people I developed pretty good friendships because we played softball quite a bit after we graduated from college. Rich Connor, Jim Cody, Sam Kaufman, a very talented fellow who really hasn't had much luck. Brad Vanderberg, another talented fellow who shot the karaoke videos of Florencia and her family in Mexico. And Jim Ziga. Ziga, the old left-hander. Reach out from first base for the ball, and the ball would go over his glove like that. Not long after USC, I went to work at Roger Corman's studio, New Horizons. Met Mike Thibault, who for about 5 years was, if not my best friend, probably the person who I did the most things with. He was a close friend, if not my best friend. I was very close with he and his wife Nancy. When they got divorced and had a child that died of crib death, it pretty much put a damper on the relationship. There's never really been the same since. Also with Thomas Harris, Debbie Brock hired me, and I also worked with Steve Barnett. The core of us were Debbie, Steve Barnett, Mike Thibault, and myself for about a year and a half. I also met Carol Oblath, Tamis Chandler, Chantal Figali, who became a pretty good friend for a couple of years. Chantal is now working in post-production at Columbia Pictures. Karen Horn, an editor. Ann Tannen was a very good friend, and she went on to... She wasn't involved with production so much as she was behind the scenes. She developed a studio, and last I heard, I talked to Ann just about a month ago, and the studio went bankrupt, and now she's just staying at home with the kids, as her husband Jay is working in construction, I believe, construction on movie sets. Kathy McDonald and Mark Pierce I met just after New Horizons at another company called New World. And then there were another group of friends I met through the TV show, just a few friends that became close friends through the TV show Salute Your Shorts, Steve Slofkin and Kirk Bailey, Kirk Amyx. And I played tennis quite a bit with those fellas. I'm gonna wrap this up now because I'm losing my throat and I need some suckers. So that's the end of the friends section. What's gonna be coming up next is going to be travels and vacations. So that's it for now. Travels and vacations coming up next.